My name is Rose Miller. I am a 34-year-old retired Army intelligence officer with 12 years of active duty under my belt. And on the humid evening of July 14th, I realized that the deadliest snakes don't hide in the tall grass of a Kandahar valley, but rather in the VIP suites of a billion-dollar cruise ship. The Oceanic Empress was a floating monument to excess, a 1,100-foot-long marvel of marine engineering cutting through the dark, choppy waters of the North Atlantic at a steady 22 knots. Inside the grand dining room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent, thick with the cloying scent of pan-seared Chilean sea bass drizzled in lemon butter reduction and the heavy, metallic tang of Clive Christian No. 1 perfume that cost $400 an ounce. Crystal chandeliers, specifically the Swarovski Empire models, vibrated almost imperceptibly with the hum of the ship's massive Wärtsilä diesel engines, casting a fractured, golden light over the silver-plated cutlery and the faces of the ultra-wealthy. My sister, Charlotte, who had just turned 31 and never spent a day in boots that weren't designer, sat across from me, smoothing the microscopic wrinkles of her $4,500 Zuhair Murad sequined gown. The fabric shimmered like oil on water, a sharp contrast to my own attire. I was wearing a $200 cocktail dress I had found at an Army surplus boutique in Fayetteville, a structured, olive-drab piece that was functional and modest, lacking the plunging neckline Charlotte used to command attention. She looked at me with eyes that scanned the room like a predator marking its territory, her lips curling into a practiced, sharp-edged sneer. "You look functional, Rose," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension she had perfected over decades of being our mother's favorite. "I guess the military didn't teach you how to wear silk, or perhaps you just lost your femininity somewhere in a dusty barracks." I didn't flinch, though my knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white as I gripped the stem of my glass. It contained a $14 Malbec, the cheapest vintage on a wine list where the bottles usually started at the price of a used sedan. I could feel the weight of my old life, the tactical precision, the constant scanning for threats, the ability to read a person's heart rate by the pulse in their neck, surging back to the surface. Charlotte wasn't just my sister, she was a variable I had failed to account for. She sipped her vintage Krug champagne, the bubbles rising in a fine, expensive mist, while I stared at the way the light caught the jagged edges of her diamond earrings. The clock on the mahogany-paneled wall clicked over to 7:14 p.m., the exact moment the evening began to tilt on its axis. I looked at the heavy gold watch on my wrist, a rugged Garmin mark that felt out of place against the white linens, and I felt a cold, familiar chill crawl up my spine. Everything about this trip, from the free tickets Charlotte had insisted were a gift of reconciliation to the specific seating chart that placed us under the watchful eyes of the ship's security cameras, began to feel like a carefully constructed kill box. I had spent my career dismantling insurgent networks, yet I had walked straight into a trap set by a woman who cried when she broke a fingernail. But I am getting ahead of myself. At that moment I was simply Rose Miller, a veteran trying to survive a dinner, unaware that the Oceanic Empress was less of a vacation and more of a gilded cage. I took a slow, measured breath, the kind I used to steady my aim, and looked Charlotte directly in her cold, blue eyes. I knew then that the war hadn't ended when I turned in my commission. It was just moving to a different theater. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as the ship groaned against a rising swell, I realized my sister had been planning my funeral since the moment we stepped onto the gangplank. The financial canyon between us wasn't just a gap. It was a sprawling, jagged abyss that defined every interaction we had since I returned from my final tour. Charlotte thrived on the construction fortune of her husband, Michael, a man whose firm specialized in high-end residential developments across the tri-state area, allowing her to drop $1,200 on a single pair of Christian Louboutin Kate pumps without so much as checking her balance. Meanwhile, I lived in a different reality, meticulously tracking every single cent of my $3,800 monthly military disability pension using a frayed Excel spreadsheet I updated every Friday morning. She had spent the last decade cultivating the image of the saintly, self-sacrificing sister, the one who stayed home to care for our aging parents while I was overseas, while I was rebranded as the broken soldier, a woman plagued by a traumatic brain injury and a mounting list of prescriptions. Charlotte insisted on managing my health with a maternalistic ferocity that made my skin crawl, claiming my memory was too fractured to handle the responsibility myself. For 6 months she had been the one refilling my weekly plastic pill organizer, her manicured fingers dropping tablets of donepezil and sertraline into the little blue compartments while she leaned over the kitchen island, whispering to Michael about my supposed decline. I would catch fragments of their conversations in the hallway, hushed tones discussing my confused state or my sudden lapses in focus, all while she kept her eyes firmly fixed on the prize. The $850,000 Victorian home in the historic district of Hartford that our parents had left exclusively to me in their will. It was a beautiful 3-story property with original stained glass windows and a wraparound porch, a house she felt entitled to simply because she had been the one present for the slow, agonizing decline of our father's health. As we sat in that opulent dining room on the ship, the smell of the sea base began to make me nauseous, not because of the cooking, but because I realized the pills she had been giving me for the last few weeks weren't the ones the VA doctors had prescribed. I had started noticing a strange metallic aftertaste in my mouth and a persistent tremor in my right hand that hadn't been there before we left port. I looked at Charlotte as she adjusted her heavy gold bracelet, the diamonds catching the light of the Swarovski chandeliers, and I saw the calculated coldness in her smile. She wasn't just my sister. She was a predator who had spent months gaslighting me into believing I was losing my mind so she could justify a power of attorney and seize the only thing I had left of our family's legacy. Every time I reached for my glass of Malbec, I saw her eyes flick toward my hand, watching for the shake, waiting for the moment I would stumble or forget a word so she could sigh and tell the waiter that her poor, hero sister just wasn't herself today. The injustice of it burned hotter than any fever I'd had in the field, a searing realization that my own blood was weaponizing my service against me. She played the role of the caregiver for the audience of our social circle, but in the quiet moments she was stripping away my dignity brick by brick, preparing to bury me in the very house I had bled to protect. I realized then that the fog in my head wasn't a symptom of my injury. It was a chemical cage she had built for me, and I was currently locked inside it in the middle of the ocean. My military training had taught me how to identify a saboteur, and as I watched her laugh at a joke Michael made, I began to formulate a counterinsurgency plan of my own, because while my brain might be injured, my soul was still a soldier's, and I wasn't about to let her take my home without a fight. Family isn't just about shared DNA. It's about loyalty, and Charlotte had traded hers for a real estate appraisal and a pair of designer shoes. The transition between the main course of roasted duck breast and the arriving dessert trolley was where the trap finally snapped shut, a moment of calculated elegance designed to mask a cold-blooded betrayal. The jazz band on the small circular stage near the center of the grand dining room began a slow, sultry rendition of My Funny Valentine, the saxophone's low notes vibrating through the polished mahogany floorboards. Charlotte, looking every bit the grieving yet supportive sister in her shimmering gown, reached out and gently squeezed Michael's hand, pulling him toward the dance floor with a playful, girlish laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I was left alone at table 42. Surrounded by the remnants of our $1,500 dinner and the clinking of heavy silver spoons against fine bone china. My peripheral vision, honed by years of scanning horizons for movement, caught a flicker of white fabric as a waitress named Elena leaned over to clear away the bread basket. Her movements were stiff, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but as she bent down, her voice came through as a ghost of a whisper, barely audible over the low hum of the ship's ventilation. "I saw your sister drop a white powder into your glass," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as she feigned to stumble to get closer to my ear. "Don't drink it, Rose, she's been watching you all night." With a practiced motion that looked like she was merely straightening the settings, she slipped a heavy leather-bound wine menu onto the table directly in front of me. I waited until she moved to the next table before I opened it, finding a small white linen napkin tucked inside the embossed gold leaf interior with 2 words scrawled in frantic smeared ink: "Switch glasses. Don't react." My heart began to hammer at a steady 110 beats per minute, a rhythmic thumping in my chest that felt like a war drum, but years of high-stakes intelligence work had taught me how to keep my physical exterior as calm as a frozen lake. I looked at the 2 identical crystal glasses of Malbec, the deep crimson liquid swirling gently with the motion of the Oceanic Empress as it crested a 10-foot swell. To any of the 300 other guests in the room, I was just a woman contemplating her drink, but to me, those glasses were now active ordnance. I waited for the exact moment Charlotte leaned her head against Michael's shoulder on the dance floor, her back turned to our table for a fleeting 3 seconds. With the surgical precision of a tactical maneuver I had practiced 1,000 times in the dark, I reached out and swapped the glasses, my hands remaining as steady as a sniper's on a cold morning. I didn't rattle the crystal and I didn't spill a single drop of the poisoned vintage. Just as the last note of the saxophone faded and the diners began to applaud, Charlotte glided back to the table, her face flushed with a fake glow of sisterly affection. She sat down, her $4,500 dress rustling like a dry autumn leaf, and she immediately reached for her own glass, the one she thought was mine. She looked at me with a smile that was too wide, too bright, and held up her drink in a mock toast to my health and my supposed recovery. I watched her, my pulse still elevated but my mind becoming sharp and clear, the chemical fog she had been inducing for months finally starting to lift under the heat of my rage. I raised my glass to meet hers, the crystal clinking with a sound that felt like the ringing of a funeral bell, and I realized that the woman sitting across from me wasn't just my sister. She was a target who had just walked into her own crosshairs. I didn't say a word, I just watched her take a long, satisfied sip of the wine she had laced with God knows what, waiting for the moment the predator realized the roles had been reversed. This wasn't about a house anymore, and it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that she had tried to erase me, and I was going to make sure she felt every second of the fallout. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I watched her swallow, I knew the truth was about to become the most bitter thing she had ever tasted. 10 minutes after the clink of poisoned crystal, I retreated to the desolate expanse of the observation deck on Deck 14, where the biting Atlantic wind whipped at my hair and the only sound was the rhythmic metallic groan of the Oceanic Empress fighting the swell. The air here smelled of salt spray and the expensive diesel exhaust of the ship's funnel, a sharp industrial contrast to the suffocating perfume of the dining room. I found a secluded corner near a life raft station and pulled a small black moleskine notebook and a Fisher Space pen from my tactical clutch, my fingers moving with a mechanical rhythm I hadn't felt since my last briefing in Kabul. I drew a single uncompromising vertical line down the center of a fresh page, dividing my life into two irreconcilable territories. On the left side I wrote the header family loyalty, but as I stared at the stark white paper under the dim recessed LED walkway lights, I realized it was a total void, a conceptual ghost that had died the moment Charlotte dropped that white powder into my glass. On the right side I inscribed the words tactical reality in bold block letters, and beneath it I began to list the casualties of my misplaced trust. My pen moved with predatory intent as I documented the forged signatures on the property tax documents I had vaguely remembered seeing on the mahogany desk in Hartford, the subtle tampering of my daily medication blister packs that had kept me in a perpetual state of cognitive shadow, and the terrifying realization that $22,400 had been systematically siphoned from my USA savings account over the last 8 months. The weight of the realization hit me with the force of a kinetic strike. The debilitating brain fog I had been fighting for over a year, the one that made me feel like I was drowning in gray wool, wasn't a lingering symptom of the IED blast that ended my career. It wasn't the war. It was her. Charlotte had been chemically erasing my identity, day by day and dose by dose, turning my own biological recovery into a weapon to facilitate a cold-blooded asset seizure of my $850,000 home and my remaining liquid net worth. She had weaponized my trauma to transform me into a ghost while I was still breathing, whispering lies to Michael and our family lawyer about my declining memory to build a paper trail for a future competency hearing. I didn't cry and I didn't tremble. Instead, I felt the cold, familiar iron of a mission objective forming in the center of my chest, a singular, crystalline focus that replaced the manufactured confusion of the last year. The North Atlantic was pitch black beyond the glass railing, a churning abyss that mirrored the absolute lack of empathy I now felt for the woman who shared my DNA. I looked at the list of her crimes, the theft, the gaslighting, the attempted poisoning, and I recognized them for what they were. Acts of war. Charlotte thought she was playing a game of social chess against a broken soldier, but she had forgotten that I was trained by the best intelligence apparatus in the world to identify, track, and neutralize threats to national security. By trying to steal my house, she had inadvertently invited a wolf into her gilded parlor. I closed the notebook with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed against the plexiglass windbreaks, my mind already calculating the logistics of the counterstrike. I needed to secure the digital evidence of those bank transfers and find a way to test the residue in my original wine glass without alerting the ship's medical staff, who were likely under the spell of her saintly nurse persona. The mission had changed from survival to systematic dismantling. As I turned to walk back toward the elevators, My gait was no longer that of a confused patient, but of an officer returning to the field. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where the truth is held sacred, but when the truth is a betrayal of this magnitude, family becomes just another target in the zone of operations. I was going to take back my life, my money, and my home, and I was going to do it with the same ruthless efficiency that Charlotte had used to try and destroy me. The hunt had officially begun. The moment the Oceanic Empress docked at the port of Manhattan and the heavy steel gangway hissed into place, I didn't hail a taxi to the quiet suburbs of Hartford or return to the Victorian house I had spent my life defending. Instead, I bypassed my own driveway and drove my 2022 slate gray Toyota 4Runner straight to the glass-fronted offices of a high-end digital forensics firm in downtown Stamford, where the air smelled of ozone and filtered ventilation. I didn't hesitate to swipe my card for a $5,000 retainer, hiring a private forensic auditor who specialized in tracing laundered assets and hidden digital footprints. While the auditor began deconstructing the $22,400 hole in my USA savings account, I returned to my property under the cover of a Tuesday afternoon and installed 4 discrete 4K Nest Cam indoor units, hiding them behind the leather-bound spine of a 1944 field manual and inside the ornate molding of my mahogany study. The wait was shorter than I anticipated, as the footage captured at 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday provided the definitive smoking gun that no amount of sisterly gaslighting could erase. There was Charlotte, moving through my private sanctuary with the practiced ease of a ghost, using her emergency spare key to let herself in while she thought I was sedated in the upstairs bedroom. The high-resolution infrared sensor caught every chilling detail of her expression as she sat at my desk, flipping through the delicate parchment of my last will and testament with a predatory, teeth-baring grin that would haunt the hallways of a morgue. She wasn't just checking the documents, she was savoring them, her manicured thumb tracing the line that granted me the $850,000 estate as if she were already measuring the windows for new curtains. Simultaneously, the secondary front of my counteroffensive delivered the killing blow to her carefully constructed narrative of the saintly caregiver. I had taken the small, unmarked white vitamins she had been pressing into my palm every morning and sent them to a specialized toxicology lab in New Jersey for a comprehensive chemical panel. The lab report, delivered via an encrypted PDF 3 days later, was a cold, clinical indictment of attempted chemical subjection. It confirmed the presence of 25 milligrams of clozapine, a potent, heavy-duty antipsychotic medication used for treatment-resistant schizophrenia, a drug I had never been prescribed and had no medical need for. The side effects listed in the report, extreme drowsiness, cognitive impairment, and severe dizziness, perfectly matched the harrowing brain fog I had been fighting for the past year. Charlotte hadn't been helping me recover from my traumatic brain injury. She had been systematically poisoning my neurological pathways to manufacture the symptoms of a mental breakdown, ensuring I would appear incompetent to any judge or lawyer who looked my way. The betrayal felt like a jagged piece of shrapnel lodged in my chest, but the tactical reality was now undeniable. My own sister was using a pharmaceutical handcuffs to restrain my mind so she could strip mine my inheritance. I sat in my darkened living room, watching the 4K footage of her gloating over my legal papers on my iPad Pro, and I felt the last vestiges of familial hesitation burn away. She had mistaken my silence for weakness and my confusion for defeat, never realizing that an intelligence officer is most dangerous when she has gathered the most data. I didn't call the police immediately, nor did I confront her with a screaming match on the front lawn. I began a meticulous filing system of every bank transfer, every frame of video, and every milligram of the clozapine she had fed me. The mission objective was no longer just protection. It was the total and absolute dismantling of Charlotte's life, piece by piece, just as she had tried to do to mine. Family is blood, but loyalty is a choice, and as I watched her image on the screen, I knew I was looking at a stranger who had declared a war she was fundamentally unequipped to win. The trap was now set, and this time I wouldn't be the one walking into it. 3 weeks after the nightmare on the Oceanic Empress, Charlotte had the audacity to throw a welcome home garden party for 55 guests on the manicured lawn of the very house she was trying to steal from me. The air in the Hartford suburbs was thick with the scent of blooming hydrangeas and $3,200 worth of catering, featuring Wagyu beef sliders on brioche buns and endless bottles of vintage Moët and Chandon Brut Imperial that flowed like water into thin crystal flutes. Every cent of the party was funded by a $20,000 personal loan she had tricked me into signing during one of my drug-induced cognitive slumps, a predatory maneuver she executed with the grace of a vulture. I watched from the shadows of the detached garage as she stood in the center of the emerald green grass, wearing a floral silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was the picture of a grieving, devoted sister, her voice cracking with practiced emotion as she whispered to my neighbors, the Millers and the Grahams, about how heartbreaking it was to watch my once sharp mind slipping away into the shadows of early-onset dementia. She played the room like a virtuoso, painting me as a tragic relic of the war while she positioned herself as the noble guardian of my dwindling legacy. At exactly 4 p.m. I stepped out from the garage and onto the stone walkway, but I wasn't the broken, sedated shell of a woman she expected to see. I was dressed in my full Class A Army service uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed to a razor edge and my brass buttons reflecting the afternoon sun like a warning flare. My medals, from the Bronze Star to my Purple Heart, were polished to a mirror shine, clinking softly with every measured rhythmic step I took toward the center of the festivities. The sudden silence that washed over the garden was absolute, the clinking of silver spoons and the murmur of gossip dying instantly as 55 pairs of eyes locked onto the ghost who had suddenly returned to life. Charlotte's face went from a mask of sympathetic sorrow to a pale, waxy sheet of terror in 3 seconds flat, her hand trembling as she gripped her champagne glass. I didn't say a word as I marched toward her, my spine as straight as a bayonet, carrying a thick legal-grade manila folder labeled in bold, black letters. Evidence. Miller Estate Audit and Toxicology Report. I stopped exactly 3 feet from her, invading her personal space with the calculated intensity of a drill sergeant. I could smell the expensive gin on her breath and the copper tang of her fear. "But I'm getting ahead of myself," I said, my voice projecting across the lawn with a command that made the caterers stop mid-pour. I reached into the folder and pulled out the 4K still frames of her at my desk at 2:14 a.m., her face illuminated by the glow of the desk lamp as she obsessed over my will. I held the photos up for the neighbors to see, the images of her predatory grin contrasting sharply with the saintly woman standing before them. I then tossed the lab report confirming the clozapine poisoning onto the linen-covered table next to the Wagyu sliders, letting the clinical proof of her betrayal sit there for everyone to read. The gasps from the crowd were the most satisfying sound I had heard in a decade. I looked her directly in the eye, watching as her carefully constructed world began to implode in the middle of her own celebration. Family isn't about blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I watched the police cruiser pull into my driveway, summoned by the silent alarm I had tripped minutes earlier, I realized that the only person leaving my house today was the sister who thought she could bury me while I was still standing. The tactical reality was simple. The war was over and I had won. "Attention everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the hollow chatter of the garden party like a seasoned commander reclaiming the bridge of a sinking ship. I didn't rely on theatrical emotion or the shaky tremors of a victim because I knew that in the theater of war, the only thing more lethal than a bullet is undeniable data. I moved with the calculated efficiency of an intelligence officer conducting a high-stakes briefing, handing out 20 color-coded, staple-bound copies of the lab results and the detailed bank statements I had spent $5,000 to authenticate. The high-gloss paper shimmered in the afternoon sun, displaying the jagged red lines that marked every illegal withdrawal and the chemical molecular structure of the 25 milligrams of clozapine she had been feeding me under the guise of sisterly care. I reached for the remote of the outdoor projection system Charlotte had rented for a celebratory montage of our childhood, but instead of nostalgic sepia-toned photos, I bypassed her carefully curated playlist to launch the 4K Nest Cam footage. The massive screen, stretched against the ivy-covered brick of my 3-story Victorian home, flickered to life with the bone-chilling clarity of a night vision feed. The guest list of 55 neighbors and local socialites went deathly silent, a vacuum of sound that swallowed the ambient hum of the Hartford suburbs. The footage from 2:14 a.m. on that Tuesday was undeniable. There was Charlotte, her floral silk dress replaced by a dark utilitarian sweater, her face twisted into a predatory, gloating mask as she meticulously photographed every page of my last will and testament. Someone in the third row of white folding chairs dropped a silver-plated cocktail fork, and the sharp metallic clang echoed across the bluestone patio like a gunshot in a canyon. I watched Michael, the man who had provided the construction fortune Charlotte so greedily spent, as his expression shifted from the confused annoyance of a slighted host to a mask of pure, cold horror. He looked at the woman he was about to marry as if she were a venomous snake that had been coiled in his bed for years, his gaze darting from the screen back to Charlotte, who was now trembling so violently that the vintage mote in her hand began to froth over the rim of the glass. I stood there in my classy uniform, the weight of my bronze star feeling like an anchor of truth, and I didn't look away from her. The hyperrealistic detail of the projection showed her manicured thumb lingering on the clause that left me the $850,000 estate, a visual confession of her motives that no lawyer could spin. I had spent a year drowning in a chemical fog she created, a state of manufactured insanity designed to strip me of my dignity and my home, but the clarity of this moment was worth every milligram of poison I had survived. The tactical reality had shifted entirely. The hunter was now the specimen under the microscope, and the saintly nurse was revealed to be a common thief with a penchant for pharmaceutical assault. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And as the first pair of flashing blue lights appeared at the end of the driveway, I realized that for the first time in 18 months, I was the only person in control of the Miller estate. I took a slow, deep breath of the salt-tinged air, feeling the last of the clozapine-induced tremors fade away, replaced by the absolute icy stillness of a mission accomplished. The garden party was over and the reckoning had just begun. "You are lying, she is crazy, look at her," Charlotte shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail that shattered the stunned silence of the Hartford afternoon. Her $1,200 manicure, featuring custom porcelain white tips, clawed at the humid air as if she could physically tear the 4K projection from the ivy-covered brick of my Victorian home. I stood as still as a stone monument in my classy uniform, my polished metals gleaming like cold, unblinking eyes, and I didn't even offer her the satisfaction of a blink. I simply raised my hand and pointed a gloved finger toward the massive screen where the infrared footage reached its most damning crescendo. The high-fidelity audio captured by the hidden Nest Cam sensors in my study filled the garden with the crystal-clear sound of her own voice recorded at 2:16 a.m. on that fateful Tuesday. "Once she is in the state-mandated care facility and the competency hearing is finalized, the house is officially ours and we can finally liquidate the estate," she had whispered to the empty room, her reflection in the dark window showing a grin that was devoid of any human warmth. The 55 guests, many of whom had spent the last hour listening to her lament my supposed mental decline over Wagyu sliders and vintage moat, stared at the screen in a paralysis of collective shock. Michael, the man who had bankrolled her lifestyle with his construction fortune, stood frozen beside the catering table, his face a pale mask of pure, cold horror. He looked at the woman he was about to marry as if she were a venomous snake that had just been uncoiled from his own chest, his gaze darting from the digital evidence of her betrayal to the shaking, floral-clad figure before him. Without saying a single word, he reached for his hand and began to slide off the $15,000 Harry Winston engagement ring, a platinum band set with a 2-carat cushion-cut diamond that caught the dying afternoon light. He dropped the ring into Charlotte's half-full glass of vintage champagne with a sharp, hollow clink that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench, the expensive bubbles fizzing around the diamond as it sank to the bottom of the poisoned vintage. "Get out," he whispered, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal, quiet fury that carried further than any shout. The rejection was absolute and instantaneous. As if by some unspoken military command, the 55 guests turned their backs on her in a synchronized wall of silence, creating a human barrier of redirected shoulders and cold indifference. Charlotte stood alone in the center of the emerald lawn she had tried to steal, stripped of her saintly nurse persona and her future inheritance in the span of a 10-minute briefing. The $3,200 catering spread sat untouched, a feast for a queen who had just been dethroned by the very soldier she thought she had chemically broken. I watched her from my position of tactical superiority, feeling the heavy, cold iron of the mission objective settle into a final, satisfying click of completion. The chemical fog of the clozapine was gone, replaced by the sharp, salt-tinged clarity of a woman who had successfully defended her perimeter against a domestic insurgent. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And as the Hartford police cruisers finally crunched up the gravel driveway to escort her off my property in handcuffs, I realized the house was finally quiet, finally mine, and finally safe. I stood tall in the fading sun, a retired Army intelligence officer who had just won the most important war of her life, watching the snake be led away from the garden she had tried to poison. The aftermath of the garden party was not just a social falling out. It was the total and systematic collapse of Charlotte's meticulously constructed empire, a structural failure that mirrored the demolition of a condemned skyscraper. I moved with tactical aggression the very next morning, filing for a permanent restraining order in the Hartford District Court and hand-delivering a digital drive containing the 4K Nest Cam footage and the toxicology reports to the district attorney's office. Within 48 hours, the woman who once spent $1,200 on a single pair of Christian Louboutins found herself in a financial vacuum after Michael took the extraordinary step of freezing every joint account they shared, effectively cutting off the oxygen to her parasitic lifestyle. When the dust settled on her primary checking account, the forensic auditor confirmed she was left with exactly $42.16 in her pocket, a pathetic sum that wouldn't even cover the tip at the restaurants she used to frequent. She was summarily evicted from the $2,800-a-month luxury apartment Michael had been subsidizing, forced to trade her floor-to-ceiling windows and marble countertops for a $600-a-month studio apartment located directly above a screeching 24-hour commercial laundromat on the industrial edge of town. The air in her new dwelling didn't smell of Clive Christian perfume anymore. It smelled of scorched lint, industrial-grade detergent, and the damp, metallic rot of a life in ruin. The woman everyone used to call the Golden Girl was now a primary person of interest in a multi-count felony fraud and aggravated assault investigation, her name appearing on police blotters rather than charity gala invitations. Every morning while I sat on the wraparound porch of my $850,000 Victorian home drinking coffee that wasn't laced with clozapine, Charlotte was waking up to the rhythmic thumping of industrial dryers vibrating through her thin linoleum floors. The $22,400 she had siphoned from my savings was being clawed back through legal maneuvers that stripped her of her remaining dignity, brick by painful brick. I watched the legal process unfold with the detached precision of an observer, seeing the once sharp predator reduced to a desperate scavenger as she tried to navigate a world where her beauty and her lies no longer carried any currency. Michael had scrubbed her from his life entirely, his $15,000 engagement ring likely sitting in a pawn shop or at the bottom of a waste bin, a silent testament to the hollow nature of her affection. The brain fog that had haunted me for over a year had vanished completely, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed me to appreciate the silence of my own house, a sanctuary that was no longer a hunting ground. I spent my afternoons walking through the rooms, reclaiming the space she had tried to steal, feeling the solid oak floors beneath my feet as a physical reminder of my victory. I realized that the war hadn't just been about a house or a bank account. It had been about the fundamental right to exist without being erased by the people who were supposed to protect me. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I looked at the empty chair where she used to sit while feeding me poison, I felt a profound sense of peace. Charlotte was gone, her empire was a pile of ash. And for the first time in my 34 years, I was truly the commanding officer of my own destiny. The mission was complete, the perimeter was secure, and the truth had finally set me free from the sister who had tried to bury me alive. I sat in the profound, heavy silence of my own living room, the very sanctuary Charlotte had tried to strip from my life with the cold-blooded efficiency of a corporate raider, as the digital clock on the mahogany mantel clicked over to 11:45 p.m. The house felt different now, no longer a gilded cage or a hunting ground but a fortified perimeter where every creak of the original oak floorboards sounded like a victory rather than a threat. I leaned back into the worn leather of my favorite armchair, the one that smelled of old books and the faint, comforting scent of gun oil from my service days, and I opened the security application on my iPhone 15 Pro Max. The 4K live feeds from the 4 hidden Nest cameras flickered onto the screen, showing the empty, moonlit corridors of my $850,000 Victorian estate, and for the first time in an agonizing, blur-filled year, my head felt as clear as a desert night after a storm. There was no gray wool pressing against my temples, no sudden, terrifying lapses in short-term memory, and no manufactured confusion that had once made me doubt my own sanity. I realized with a crystalline, razor-sharp certainty that my sister had never been the saintly nurse helping me survive the neurological aftermath of an IED blast in Kandahar. Instead, she had been meticulously weaponizing my trauma against me, turning my recovery into a tactical vulnerability she could exploit for profit. I looked at the high-definition footage of the study where she had once stood over my will, and the realization hit me with the force of a kinetic strike that I had never been the broken one in this family dynamic. While I had returned from the war with physical scars and a weary mind, Charlotte had spent her entire 31 years living with a gaping, necrotic hole in her soul that no amount of Michael's construction fortune or $1,200 designer shoes could ever hope to fill. She was a hollow shell of a human being who viewed familial loyalty as a currency to be traded and sisterhood as a strategic obstacle to be dismantled through chemical subjection. The 25 milligrams of clozapine she had been feeding me weren't just pills. They were the shackles of a silent war she had declared on my very identity. A war I had finally won through the same intelligence gathering and decisive action that had kept me alive in the field. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway provided a soundtrack to my new reality, one where the perimeter was secure and the infiltrator had been permanently neutralized. I took a slow, deliberate sip of iced water, savoring the lack of that bitter metallic clozapine aftertaste that had defined my life for the last 6 months. Charlotte was likely sitting in her damp $600 studio apartment right now, listening to the roar of the laundromat dryers and realizing that she had traded her sister, her reputation, and her future for $42 and a felony fraud investigation. I didn't feel pity for her, and I didn't feel the need to seek further vengeance. The data was out, the truth was documented in 20 color-coded folders, and the social wall of rejection from her former peers was a prison of her own making. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And as I watched the shadows of the oak trees dance across the living room wall, I knew that I was finally the sole commanding officer of my own life. I closed the app, set my phone on the side table, and allowed myself to simply exist in the silence, a soldier who had finally found her way back home through the fog. The war was over, the estate was secure, and for the first time in years, the Miller legacy was in the hands of the only person who actually knew the value of the ground she stood on. I reclaimed my territory with a level of military precision that Charlotte could never have anticipated, executing a strategic withdrawal from a life that had become a minefield of betrayal and gold-sequined ghosts. Within 45 days of the garden party, I had listed the Victorian estate in Hartford for $850,000, but the bidding war sparked by its historic charm and pristine condition drove the final sale price to a staggering $890,000. I didn't linger to watch the new owners move their lives into the rooms where I had once been poisoned. Instead, I packed my 2022 slate gray Toyota 4Runner with only the essentials and drove 2,000 miles west to a rugged 20-acre ranch in the Big Sky country of Montana. My new home was a timber-framed sanctuary tucked against the base of the Gallatin Range, far from the suffocating whispers of Connecticut social circles and the predatory shadow of a sister who had tried to erase my existence for a real estate appraisal. I took the recovered $22,400 that the forensic auditor had clawed back from Charlotte's frozen accounts and used it as the seed capital to establish the Miller Sentinel Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial advocacy for veterans facing domestic financial abuse and predatory guardianship. In my new home office, which looked out over a sprawling valley of ponderosa pines and granite peaks rather than manicured lawns and Swarovski chandeliers, I placed a single, modest item on the wall next to my bronze star and my purple heart. It was the original leather-bound wine menu from the Oceanic Empress, and inside, protected by a piece of archival-grade glass, sat the white linen napkin with the smeared ink that read, "Switch glasses. Don't react." It remained my most cherished tactical trophy, a silent, powerful tribute to Elena, the waitress and stranger who had chosen to see the truth and act upon it when my own blood had refused to. Charlotte was now nothing more than a case number in a Hartford felony fraud file, likely still waking up to the industrial hum of that $600 a month laundromat studio, while I woke up to the sound of the wind through the pines and the absolute, ironclad clarity of a mind that was finally, permanently free. The 25 milligrams of clozapine she had forced into my system were a distant chemical memory, replaced by the sharp, clean oxygen of the mountains and the rhythmic labor of maintaining my own land. I realized that my service hadn't ended when I left the Army Intelligence Corps. It had simply shifted into a new theater of operations where I could protect those who, like me, had been targeted by the people they trusted most. The financial canyon between my life and Charlotte's was now an unbridgeable sea of my own making, a distance measured not just in miles or dollars, but in the fundamental integrity of a soul that had survived a domestic insurgency. I had sold the house that was meant to be my tomb and used the proceeds to build a life that was a fortress of my own design, proving that while my brain may have been injured by the war, my spirit was an unbreakable asset. Family isn't just a matter of shared DNA or childhood memories. Family is the person who stands in the gap when the darkness closes in, and as I looked at the napkin on my wall, I knew that a stranger's integrity had saved me when a sister's greed had tried to bury me. I sat at my desk, the sun setting behind the mountains in a violent wash of orange and purple, and I felt a sense of peace that no amount of Michael's construction fortune could ever buy. The mission was officially closed, the perimeter was permanent, and for the first time in my 34 years, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what I was worth. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and in the end, the only person who stayed for the real Rose Miller was the woman who had fought her way back from the fog to claim her own life. My name is Rose Miller, I am 34 years old, and I am a survivor of a war that was fought not just in the dust of Kandahar, but in the polished, silent corners of my own dining room. The final legal reckoning for my sister Charlotte arrived with a clinical coldness that mirrored the way she used to dispense my daily doses of clozapine, resulting in a 3-year suspended sentence and a court-ordered restitution plan that stripped away every last vestige of her socialite identity. She who once spent $1,200 on a single afternoon at a boutique is currently working as a dishwasher in a greasy spoon diner on the outskirts of Hartford, her $4,500 Zuhair Murad gowns replaced by a damp, industrial apron as she scrubs the remnants of other people's meals to pay back the $22,400 she siphoned from my savings. She thought she could outsmart a retired Army intelligence officer simply because I had a traumatic brain injury, betting her entire future on the belief that a soldier's mind could be permanently clouded by a pharmaceutical fog. But she was fundamentally and catastrophically wrong about the resilience of a woman trained to survive in the dark. I sit now in the quiet of my Montana ranch, the air outside my window cooling to a crisp 38 degrees as the sun dips behind the jagged silhouette of the Gallatin Range, casting long, deep purple shadows across the timber-framed office where I run my foundation for abused veterans. The silence here is a living thing, a profound and peaceful absence of the gaslighting whispers and the clinking of poisoned crystal that defined my life under Charlotte's supposed care. I look at the framed napkin from Elena, the waitress who saw the truth when my own blood refused to, and I realize that the most important mission of my life wasn't conducted in a uniform, but in the moments I chose to believe in my own reality over the lies of a predator. Charlotte is a ghost of a life I no longer recognize, a person of interest in a felony fraud investigation who proved that shared DNA is a biological fact but loyalty is a sacred tactical choice. She had the audacity to try and bury me while I was still breathing, attempting to seize an $850,000 legacy by treating my service as a weakness, never understanding that a soldier's greatest weapon is her ability to adapt, overcome and outmaneuver any insurgency, even one that shares her last name. The financial canyon between us is now absolute, a void that separates my life of purpose and recovery from her existence of labor and disgrace. And as the grandfather clock in my hallway ticks with a steady, reliable rhythm, I feel the last of the chemical iron leave my soul. I am Rose Miller and I have reclaimed my name, my house and my sanity from the woman who tried to steal them in the middle of the North Atlantic. Family isn't just who stays when the truth comes out. It is the people who respect the truth enough to never try and poison it in the first place. I have found my peace in the high-altitude clarity of the mountains, far from the gold-sequined ghosts of my past, knowing that the perimeter is secure and the infiltrator has been permanently neutralized by the weight of her own greed. The war that started in a grand dining room ended with a quiet victory on a Montana ranch, and as I close my laptop for the night, I know that the only thing I ever truly lost was a sister who never really deserved to be called one.